Kit Carson's Autobiography. I was born on December 24th, 1809 in Madison County, Kentucky. My parents moved to Missouri when I was 1 year old and settled in what is now Howard County. For 2 or 3 years after our arrival, we had to remain forted, and it was necessary to have men stationed at the ends of the fields for the protection of those that were laboring. For 15 years I lived in Missouri, and during that time I dwelt in Howard County. I was apprenticed to David Workman to learn the saddler's trade, and remained with him 2 years. The business did not suit me, and having heard so many tales of life in the mountains of the West, I concluded to leave him. He was a good man, and I often recalled the kind treatment I received at his hands, but taking into consideration that if I remained with him and served my apprenticeship, I would have to pass my life in labor that was distasteful to me, and being anxious to travel for the purpose of seeing different countries, I concluded to join the first party that started for the Rocky Mountains. In August 1826, I had the good fortune to hear of one bound for that country. I made application to join this party and was accepted without any difficulty. On the road, one of the party, Andrew Broadus, met with a serious accident. He was taking his rifle out of a wagon for the purpose of shooting a wolf, and in drawing it out, accidentally discharged it, receiving the contents in the right arm. We had no medical man with us, and he suffered greatly from the effects of the wound. His arm began to mortify, and we all were aware that amputation was necessary. One of the party stated that he could do it. Broadus was prepared for any experiment that was considered of service to him. The doctor set to work and cut the flesh with a razor and sawed the bone with an old saw. The arteries being cut, to stop the bleeding, he heated a king bolt from one of the wagons and burned the affected parts, and then applied a plaster of tar taken off the wheel of the wagon. The patient became perfectly well before our arrival in New Mexico. We arrived at Santa Fe in November, and I proceeded to Fernandez de Taos, my present place of residence, the same month, and remained during the winter with an old mountaineer by the name of Kincaid. In the spring of 1827, I started for the States, but on the Arkansas River I met a party en route for New Mexico. I joined them and remained with them until their arrival at Santa Fe. I then hired with a man whose name I have forgotten to drive a team, my wages being $1 per day. I remained in his employ till our arrival at El Paso, when I took my discharge and returned to Santa Fe. I left Santa Fe for Taos shortly after my arrival from El Paso and obtained employment as a cook with Mr. Ewing Young, my board being the remuneration. In the spring of 1828, I once more departed for the States, met a party on the Arkansas, and again returned to Santa Fe. I then was employed by Colonel Trammell, a merchant, as interpreter. I accompanied him to Chihuahua, and then hired with Robert McKnight to go to the copper mines on the Rio Gila, where I remained a few months, driving a team. Not satisfied with this employment, I took my discharge and departed for Taos, where I arrived in August. Sometime before my arrival, Mr. Ewing Young had sent a party of trappers to the Colorado of the West. In a fight with the Indians, they were defeated. Having fought all of one day and gaining no advantage, they considered it prudent to return. Young then raised another party of 40 men, consisting of Americans, Canadians, and Frenchmen, which I joined and took command himself. We left Taos in August 1829. In those days, licenses were not granted to citizens of the United States to trap within the limits of Mexico. To avoid all mistrust on the part of the government officers, we traveled in a northern direction for 50 miles and then changed our course to the southwest. Traveling through the country occupied by the Navajo Indians, we passed the village of Zuni and on to the head of Salt River, one of the tributaries of the Rio Gila. Here we met the same Indians that had defeated the former party. Young directed the greater part of his men to hide themselves, which was done, the men concealing themselves under blankets, pack saddles, and as best they could. The hills were covered with Indians, and seeing so few of us, they concluded to make an attack and drive us from our position. Our commander allowed them to enter the camp and then ordered us to fire on them, which was done. The Indians having 15 or 20 warriors killed and a great number wounded. They were routed, and we continued our march, trapping down Salt River to the mouth of San Francisco River and up to the head of the latter stream. We were nightly harassed by the Indians, who would frequently crawl into our camp, steal a trap or two, kill a mule or a horse, and do whatever damage they could. On the head of San Francisco River, the party was divided, one section of which I was a member, to proceed to the valley of the Sacramento in California, and the other to return to Taos for traps to replace those which had been stolen, and to dispose of the beaver we had caught. Young took charge of the party for California, consisting of 18 men. We remained where we were a few days after the departure of the Taos party for the purpose of procuring meat and making the necessary arrangements for a journey through a country which had never been explored. Game was very scarce. After remaining 3 days continually on the hunt to procure the necessary supplies, we found we had killed only 3 deer, the skins of which we took off in such a manner as to make tanks for the purpose of carrying water. We then started on our expedition in the best of spirits, having heard from the Indians that the streams of the valley to which we were going were full of beaver, but that the country over which we were to travel was very barren, and that we would suffer very much for want of water, the truth of which we were very soon to know. The first 4 days' march was over a country sandy, burned up, and without a drop of water. Each night we received a small quantity of water from the tanks which we had been foresighted enough to provide. A guard was placed over them to prohibit anyone from making use of more than his due allowance. After 4 days' travel, we found water. Before we reached it, the pack mules were strung along the road for several miles. They smelled the water long before we had any hopes of finding any, and all made the best use of the strength left in them after their severe sufferings to reach it as soon as they could. We remained here 2 days. It would have been impractical to continue the march without giving the men and the animals rest which they so much needed. After remaining in camp 2 days, we resumed our expedition, and for 4 days traveled over a country similar to that which we had traversed before our arrival at the last water. There was no water to be found during this time, and we suffered extremely on account of it. On the 4th day, we arrived on the Colorado of the West, below the Great Canyon. Our joy when we discovered the stream can better be imagined than described. We had also suffered greatly for want of food. We met a party of Mojave Indians and purchased from them a mare heavy with foal. The mare was killed and eaten by the party with great gusto. Even the foal was devoured. We camped on the banks of the Colorado for 3 days, recruiting our animals and trading for provisions with the Indians, from whom we procured a few beans and some corn. Then we took a southwestern course, and in 3 days' march struck the bed of a stream running northeast, which rises in the Coast Range and is lost in the sands of the Great Basin. We proceeded up this stream for 6 days, and 2 days after our arrival on it we found water. We then left the stream and traveled in a westerly direction, and in 4 days arrived at the mission of San Gabriel. At the mission there was 1 priest, 15 soldiers, and about 1,000 Indians. They had about 80,000 head of stock, fine fields and vineyards. In fact, it was a paradise on earth. We remained 1 day at the mission, receiving good treatment from the inhabitants and purchasing from them what beef we required. We had nothing but butcher knives to trade, and for 4 of these they would give us a beef. In 1 day's travel from this mission, we reached the mission of San Fernando, having about the same number of inhabitants, but not conducted on as large a scale as the one of San Gabriel. We then took a northwest course and passed over the mountains into the valley of the Sacramento. We had plenty to eat and found grass in abundance for our animals. We found signs of trappers on the San Joaquin. We followed their trail and in a few days overtook the party and found them to belong to the Hudson's Bay Company. They were 60 men strong, commanded by Peter Ogden. We trapped down the San Joaquin and its tributaries and found but little beaver, but plenty of other game, elk, deer, and antelope in thousands. We traveled near each other until we came to the Sacramento River, where we separated. Ogden going up the Sacramento, bound for the Columbia River. We remained on the Sacramento during the summer, and since it was not the season for trapping, we passed our time in hunting. During our stay on the Sacramento, a party of Indians from the mission of San Rafael ran away and took refuge at a village of Indians who were not friendly with those of the mission. The priest of San Rafael sent a party of 15 Indians in pursuit. They applied to a village that was friendly for assistance and were furnished with a number of men they required. They then moved towards the village where the runaways were concealed and demanded that they be given up, which was refused. Then they attacked the village, but after a severe struggle, they were compelled to retreat. Then they came to us and requested our help, and Mr. Young directed me and 11 other men to join them. We returned to the village and made an attack and fought for 1 entire day. The Indians were routed and lost a great number of men. We entered the village in triumph, set fire to it, and burned it to the ground. The next day we demanded the runaways and informed the Indians that if they were not immediately given up, we would not leave one of them alive. They complied with our demands, and we turned our prisoners over to those from whom they had deserted and returned to our camp. Mr. Young and 4 of us proceeded with the Indians to San Rafael, taking with us the beaver we had on hand. We were well received by the missionaries. At the mission we found a trading schooner, the captain of which was ashore. We traded our furs with him, and with the money we obtained purchased at the mission all the horses we required and returned to our camp. End of part 1.